Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
There are television shows, and then there are television experiences, the kind that lodge themselves so deep into the cultural consciousness that decades later, people still talk about them as if they were old friends. MASH was one of those rare experiences. It ran for 11 seasons on CBS, from 1972 to 1983, outlasting the actual Korean War it was set in by nearly a decade. At its peak, it was one of the most watched programs on American television, and its series finale remains one of the most viewed broadcasts in TV history, drawing over 106 million viewers on the night it aired. But sustaining something that powerful over 11 years doesn't come without a cost. Behind the laughter and the heartbreak, behind the helicopters and the operating tables, real people were dealing with real struggles, creative frustration, personal exhaustion, professional ambition, and the quiet ache that comes from knowing you've outgrown a role. MASH was never short on brilliance, but it was also never short on tension. And when that tension became too much, some of the show's most beloved actors made the difficult decision to walk away. When you talk about the original heart of MASH, you have to talk about McLean Stevenson. His portrayal of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, bumbling, warm, endlessly well-meaning, gave the show an emotional center in its earliest years that audiences absolutely adored. Henry Blake wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just a man trying to survive the absurdity of command in the middle of a war, and that relatability made him one of the most likable characters on television at the time. McLean earned a Golden Globe for the role. He was celebrated by critics and cherished by fans. By any conventional measure, he had landed in an extraordinary place. But conventional measures weren't enough for McLean Stevenson. He had bigger dreams, not out of vanity, but out of a deep, burning belief that he had the talent to carry a show entirely on his own shoulders. He didn't want to be part of an ensemble. He wanted to be the headline. The trouble was that as MASH evolved, the show began gravitating more and more toward Alan Alda's Hawkeye Pierce. Alda was magnetic, deeply committed, and increasingly involved in the creative direction of the series. His character became the moral and emotional fulcrum around which everything else rotated. For McLean, this meant watching his own role quietly diminish, not dramatically, not cruelly, but noticeably. He once openly stated his desire to be the #1 star, to be the man carrying the show. Some people read that as ego. Those who knew him read it as honesty. At the end of season 3, McLean told the producers he was done. What happened next became one of the most legendary moments in television history. Rather than giving Henry Blake a gentle, feel-good farewell, the writers made a decision that still sends chills down the spines of longtime viewers. Radar walked into the operating room and quietly delivered the news that Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, and there were no survivors. No dramatic score. No cathartic goodbye. Just a line, a silence, and an audience left completely devastated. The episode generated thousands of letters to CBS, some praising the show's brutal honesty, others furious at the loss. Either way, no one was indifferent. The death of Henry Blake said something that a transfer or a retirement never could have. War does not offer clean endings. As for McLean, things did not unfold the way he had imagined. His NBC variety programs failed to capture the lightning he had left behind. His sitcoms were short-lived. In a later interview, he admitted with considerable candor that leaving MASH had been a mistake, that he had walked away from something irreplaceable in pursuit of something that ultimately didn't exist. He passed away in 1996, remembered warmly by his castmates and mourned by fans who never quite forgave fate for taking Henry Blake from them so soon. If McLean's departure was a thunderclap, Wayne Rogers' exit was a slow leak, quiet, methodical, and, in the end, completely on his own terms. Wayne played trapper John McIntyre, the other half of MASH's original comedic duo. He and Alda's Hawkeye were electric together, a pair of irreverent, rule-breaking surgeons whose chemistry gave the early seasons much of their energy and joy. Wayne had come onto MASH with a reasonable expectation that this would be a true ensemble production with the spotlight distributed fairly among the core cast. What he discovered instead was that the show had a clear center of gravity, and that center was Alan Alda. As Alda became more involved in writing and directing, Hawkeye Pierce became something far beyond a co-lead. He became the conscience of the entire series. Trapper John, meanwhile, went from scene stealer to scene support. Wayne would later describe the shift with characteristic bluntness. noting that Trapper had gone from being a full partner in the storytelling to essentially a character who stood nearby and agreed with whatever Hawkeye said. For an actor with Wayne's intelligence, he had studied history at Princeton before his acting career took off. That creative diminishment was genuinely hard to accept. What makes Wayne's story particularly unusual is the legal dimension. When the producers, learning of his decision not to return, threatened legal action for breach of contract, they discovered something remarkable. Wayne had never formally signed his contract. He had been working on a handshake agreement from the very beginning. There was no legal document to breach. He was simply free to go. The show handled his absence awkwardly, a brief explanation in the season 4 premiere that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye was away, and the audience reacted with genuine shock. First Henry, now Trapper. What was happening to the show they loved? What was happening, as it turned out, was evolution. Mike Farrell stepped in as B.J. Honeycutt, a character written with more emotional depth and complexity than Trapper had been given, and MASH began its transformation from a sharp-edged comedy into something more profound. Many fans will argue the early seasons were the best. Others believe the show only truly found its soul after Trapper left. Both positions have merit. Wayne went on to build a remarkably successful second career as a financial investor and television commentator, and by all accounts, he bore no lasting resentment toward the show or his former castmates. Alan Alda spoke of him with genuine affection long after his departure, and when Wayne passed away in 2015, Alda's tribute was as warm as any that could be written for an old friend. Of all the departures in MASH history, Gary Burghoff's may be the most quietly heartbreaking. He was the only cast member to carry his role over from the original 1970 film, and in doing so, he transformed Radar O'Reilly from a minor supporting character into one of the most beloved figures in American television history. Where the film's Radar had been mischievous and slightly cynical, Gary's version was tender, earnest, and possessed of a gentle innocence that served as a constant emotional counterweight to the brutality surrounding him. Radar could hear the helicopters before anyone else. He kept a teddy bear on his bunk. He wrote letters home for soldiers who couldn't find the words themselves. In a show about the cost of war, Radar represented what was most worth protecting, the softness in people that war is always trying to destroy. But playing that character, season after season, at the level Gary demanded of himself, was taking a serious toll. By his own later account, the combination of a punishing production schedule, personal perfectionism, anxiety, and depression left him increasingly unable to cope with the demands of the role. He was also missing critical years with his young daughter, sacrificing his family life for a show that, however meaningful, could not give him back the time he was losing. Gary quietly negotiated for reduced appearances and more time off, and the producers tried to accommodate him. But the accommodation was never quite enough. The emotional reservoir he drew from to play Radar was the same reservoir sustaining him in real life, and eventually, it ran dry. His farewell episode, a two-part story titled Goodbye, Radar, gave him the send-off the character deserved. It ended with Radar walking away from the camp alone, silhouetted against the sky, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk. There was barely a word spoken. There didn't need to be. After MASH, Gary stepped away from Hollywood almost entirely. He found solace in painting, in wildlife conservation, and, in one of those wonderful unexpected turns real life occasionally offers, in inventing, including a patented fishing tackle system. He left the spotlight not in bitterness, but in pursuit of healing. Few people who followed the show could blame him for that. For 5 seasons, Larry Linville played Major Frank Burns with a commitment that was almost heroic in its dedication to being thoroughly unlikable. Frank was petty, cowardly, self-righteous, and deeply insecure, and Larry played every one of those qualities to perfection. He was the character audiences loved to despise, the necessary foil that made Hawkeye and Trapper's rebellions feel justified. But here is the thing about playing a cartoon villain on a show that is constantly growing more sophisticated. Eventually, the cartoon starts to look out of place. As MASH deepened its exploration of moral ambiguity, trauma, and the psychological cost of war, Frank Burns remained frozen in his original function: punchline, obstacle, comic irritant. Larry, who was a genuinely skilled actor with considerably more range than the role allowed him to demonstrate, recognized the creative ceiling he had hit. He left at the end of season 5, not because he was pushed or pressured, but because he understood, with clarity and intellectual honesty, that Frank Burns had gone as far as he could go. The character's arc was complete, or rather, the character didn't have an arc at all, and that had become the problem. His exit reshaped the show in ways that proved genuinely transformative. With Frank gone, MASH introduced David Ogden Stiers as Charles Emerson Winchester III, a character so different from Frank that he essentially demanded an entirely new kind of storytelling. Winchester was cultured, arrogant, and brilliant, but he was also capable of growth, grief, and genuine humanity. The show's comedy became less reliant on cruelty and more rooted in irony. And in that shift, MASH found the final form that would carry it to its legendary conclusion. Larry Linville never found another role that matched the visibility of Frank Burns. But in a very real sense, the quality of the show after his departure is itself a kind of tribute to the space he created by leaving. What is remarkable about MASH, looking back, is not that it lost key cast members over 11 seasons. Every long-running show does. What is remarkable is that it absorbed each departure and emerged stronger, more emotionally complex, more honest about what it was trying to say. McLean Stevenson leaving gave the show its most shocking and defining dramatic moment. Wayne Rogers leaving pushed MASH toward deeper emotional territory. Gary Burghoff leaving forced the series to confront its own passage of time. Larry Linville leaving freed the show from the comfortable trap of easy villainy. Each exit was, in its own way, a kind of gift, unintentional, sometimes painful, but ultimately generative. The actors who left did so for deeply human reasons: ambition, exhaustion, creative frustration, the need to protect what mattered most to them. None of them were wrong to feel what they felt. And none of them, whatever came after, can ever be separated from the show that made them unforgettable. MASH endures because it told the truth about war, about people, and about the impossible task of staying whole when everything around you is falling apart. The actors who left were living proof of that truth. And the ones who stayed were proof of something equally powerful, that some things, even under the most difficult circumstances, are worth holding on to.